Getting there, bit by bit. All right, that's in place. There. Whoop, and I need to mute that because otherwise we're going to get an echo. Okay. There we go. You know what? I think I can do one more level, maybe two more levels. It's a little too big. Okay, we will start there. Good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for joining me in our continued discussion in this 5784, this new year. We are on the second parashat Noach. Noach, of course, is most famous for the story of the Mabul, the flood, the deluge, as often put in fancy English. But what we're going to look at today is actually the after effect of the flood. I'm not talking about the Tower of Babel. That's something I've discussed in other classes, but the immediate aftermath with God in particular as our focus, rather than Noach and his family, rather than the animals. So with that as our preface, let's go ahead and pick up here in the middle of chapter 8, and we are on verse 13. And so it was in the 601st year, in the beginning month of the first day of the month, that the waters left firm ground upon the earth. Noach removed the covering of the ark and saw, here, the face of the ground had dried up. All right, so this is after the story with the raven and the story with the dove, and this is the actual first very clear indication, directly visible by Noah himself, not just by the birds, that indeed the water has descended. Now, in the second month, on the 27th day of the month, the earth was dry. The second month, of course, being the month of Iyar, not the month of Mar Cheshvan, which we have just begun, remembering the Bible always counts months, from the month of Nisan, the month of the Exodus. God spoke to Noah, saying, go out of the ark, you and your wife, your sons and your son wives with you, all living things that are with you, all flesh, birds, animals, and all crawling things that crawl about on the earth, bring out with you, that they may swarm on the earth, that they may bear fruit and become many on the earth. So God gives a set of instructions here, just as he had given instructions to Noah to go into the ark and to take the animals. He is now being given instructions to leave the ark and to take the animals, and that these animals are meant to return to the earth and return to their normal acts of procreation. It is from this particular section and wording that different midrashim talk about the debate of whether or not the animals procreated on the ark or whether they had to wait until afterwards. And that's a lively debate in the midrash, but not our debate today, but certainly a good one to look into if you are interested. Verse 18. So Noah went out, his sons, his wife, and his sons' wives with him, all living things, all crawling things, and all birds that crawl about on the earth. According to their clans, they went out of the ark. Lemishpechotechem, tehem, excuse me, not your families, but their families, is the word here being translated as clans. It can be, of course, just translated as their families. Again, this is part of the debate about the procreation on the ark. But what it seems to mean, at least in Peshat, a straightforward meaning of the text, is that they each went back to their species, that species that had been separated and forced to be near each other on the ark were now able to go back into their family communities and not be living in such unnatural proximity to one another, each going according to their species behavior. Verse 20 is going to sort of begin the cycle here of reflection at the end of the flood. So start paying extra attention for our discussion. Noah built an altar to Adonai. He took from all pure animals and from all pure birds and offered up offerings on the altar. Now, if you are suddenly alarmed that Noah is taking 50% of these populations. I will remind you that while the kid songs and the Noah's Ark displays that you may see all have 2 of each animal, that in fact it says quite clearly at the beginning of the story that Noah was instructed to take 7 of each of the animals that were considered to be tahor, that were considered to be pure. So there were spare animals, if you will, that indeed would be usable for a sacrifice at this time. Adonai smelled the smoothing savor, and Adonai said in his heart, I will never curse the ground again on humankind's account, since what the human heart forms is evil from its youth. I will never again strike down all living things as I have done. Never again all the days of the earth shall, never again, sort of comma, all the days of the earth shall, sowing and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night, ever cease. And one of the reasons I chose Fox's translation for this morning is because of his poetry, and I apologize that my own stutter got in the way there, but trying to capture these pairs that go in the Hebrew, showing that eternal cycle of life that had been interrupted by the flood, that everything had been thrown out of whack. Now it will return to the normal pattern, that the earth's days will continue, and there will be seeding and harvesting. There will be cold and heat, meaning the weather is going to continue to change rather than being stuck in one form or another. And of course, there will be summer and winter, definitely making sure that the winter rains are not perpetual, causing a flood like this. And as a final dichotomy, Yom V'Laila, and of course, there will be day and night. Now, implicit in all of this, I should point out, is the idea at the beginning of verse 22, Od Kol Yemei Haaretz, that it will continue like this for the days of the world or the days of the land. There are some commentators who do say that this is a reminder that the world is not eternal. This physical world is not eternal. It is incredibly lengthy, and we certainly hope it will continue for many, many thousands, if not millions of years more. But we should recognize that this world, which seems so permanent under us, and which does behave with such regularity, will eventually, in the million years of time, no longer be what it is. Something to bear in mind. Okay, now, what are we going to focus on here? Well, what I wanted to talk about was this section here, verses 20 and 21, where Noah is building an altar where he makes sacrifices and where God responds to those sacrifices. In particular, we need to look at the response that God gives in verse 21. After all, Noah offering up sacrifices, that's normal. We already saw Cain and Abel do that in last week's Torah portion, to disastrous effect, unfortunately. But here we are seeing God respond to it in a way that is not only of giving favor to Abel over Cain, but seems to also cause some level of reflection, of insight, of alteration, and all of those words are said with hesitancy, because just like stating that God smelled these aromas, it seems awkward with our understanding of God to say that God is somehow coming to a realization. And yet that is what the language seems to be implying. Whenever we say that something is said libo or belibo, or either to the heart or in the heart, it seems to imply that this is an internal contemplation, reflection, and decision. Now that's perfectly fine and normal for humans, and we do that, we hope, all the time. The change of heart is not something to be embarrassed by, as long as the change of heart is founded on good reasoning. However, God, being perfect in all ways, should not be changing opinion. What, the smoke made God change his mind? The flood made God change his mind? Can God's mind change at all? What's going on here? All right, well, let's untangle this because we need to figure out what's going on, because if you miss these verses at the end here of chapter 8, and the last thing you focused on was just the olive branch in the dove's mouth, then you really missed what the purpose of the story of the flood was. Well, I don't want to be too grand. There are many purposes to the story. It is incredibly rich and full of wisdom, but there is a purpose here found right at the beginning of the Torah that is, in my opinion, meant to ground us for everything that comes later, and is meant to give us an understanding of this world and of God and of ourselves that often gets passed up for the fade to credit scene of Noah holding a dove with an olive branch. This, what we see here in 20 and 21, is infinitely more important. Okay, let's hope I don't overbuild that. I don't want to get you too excited and disappoint, but we'll see what I can do. All right, so first of all, we have to take care of the elephant in the room of the anthropomorphism. Heaven forbid that one conclude from our verse that God smells. Neither does he eat, as who did eat the fat of their sacrifices states, right? So we know that God does not actually eat the sacrifices. We know that God does not smell the sacrifices. God has no mouth, God has no nose with which to either eat or smell. So what does it mean, says Ibn Ezra? The meaning of our verse is that God accepted the burnt offering and it pleased him. It may be compared to a human being who smells a pleasant scent and enjoys. As the Talmud says, and as our commentators have said over and over, the Torah speaks in the language of humanity, meaning that the Torah uses phrasing and metaphor and imagery, even about God, that is meant to evoke certain understanding and emotions in the reader, but is not meant to indicate a physical reality when we're talking about God in particular. Excuse me. So if we say that God smells, or even that we say God has a heart, it doesn't mean that there is literally nostrils or literally a blood pumping device somewhere in God's body, which similarly doesn't exist. Instead, and that's the second half of Ibn Ezra's quote here that's so important, instead, it is meant to establish a comparison so that we, the reader, can begin to try to understand the importance of whatever it is the text is talking about in a way that is more familiar to us, because it is true for all humans, well, maybe not quite Moses, that we have a great deal of difficulty fully comprehending God, given God's fundamental different existence. The nature of God's existence is so different than ours, it's very hard to grasp. And so these metaphors are there to give us a glimpse. So by saying there was a smell that God liked, we are trying to say that is, guys, whenever you have that pleasant smell and you smell it and things feel better, and there's a change of mood, and indeed odor is incredibly powerful at changing our mood, well, that's what we should be feeling about this change that the Torah is describing, or at least perceived change that the Torah is describing for us. We need to recognize that something very important has happened here that has made this whole catastrophe of the flood actually come out with a positive resolution. Now, what is that positive resolution? Well, we're going to get to that. But that's what this whole smelling business is about. So Kuzkuni offers this as our way of trying to understand what's happening here in 20 and 21. Prior to the deluge, the flood, the Lord had seen fit to feel saddened in his heart. We saw that God was said to have even regretted the creation of humanity. Now, with this statement of the positive effect of the sacrifice, which again is meant as a metaphor, it's not just the sacrifice, God feels greatly encouraged about the human species he had created. All right, so Kuzkuni gets us down to business very quickly, that the story of Noah is bracketed. There are bookends on both sides. The first side is God's seeming regret at the creation of humanity, and the end is God's seeming acceptance, tolerance, or even enthusiasm for humanity. And in between, there is the catastrophe of the flood. And that's what we should look at as being our full story. And again, we need God's response to the flood, just like we needed God's initial reflections before the flood to understand what's going on with the flood. So how do we know that God is feeling more encouraged? Well, because we get this statement by God, I will not continue, right? That's our, let me just pull us back up over here, right? The lo osif, which gets repeated twice, in fact, in verse 21, which we'll talk about in just a second, that God is saying he's not going to curse the ground against humanity, that this is not going to strike down all living things. God seems to be choosing a different path. Just as he chose a different path when the flood began, now there seems to be a different path when the flood ends. Now, that double meaning is important, right? It can mean, according to the plain meaning of the text, that God is not going to support this human species, but this additional, apparently superfluous word, ode, which means again or furthermore or also, the first word refers to the earth, whereas the second word refers to the living creatures on it. All right, just so that you can try to understand this, when we are in the Hebrew, which is even in Fox's close translation doesn't quite come through, there is an apparent redundancy, well, two apparent redundancies. One I already mentioned, lo'osif is mentioned twice. I will no longer continue or do again. The other way of doing it, the other redundancy, however, is that this word ode comes as part of it. It would be like saying, I will never do it again, nor do it. It's very superfluous, as Chris Cooney said. It would be perfectly fine for that word ode to be deleted. Since it's not, then we need to unpack it. How should we understand it? Well, says Cooney, we should recognize that this is a two-part promise that God is making, or declaration, more accurately. That on the one hand, God is saying a promise about not destroying the earth, and on the other hand, he's making a promise about not destroying the things that live on that earth. Now, we can see in Or HaChaim an expansion upon this theme of the dual nature of God's statement. So when God curses living creatures, there is no noticeable effect of any previous curse, as any living creatures that had been cursed or smitten prior to the present curse were already dead, and as if they had never existed. Okay, what does that mean? Well, it means that we need to have this double layer of not for the things living as well as not for the earth, because when we say not for the things living, it's not immediately obvious that the victims of any previous smiting or cursing would recognize the difference, because they're dead. And being dead, they're not really perceptive. That's one of the drawbacks of being deceased. More to the point, however, it's impossible to even know that the curse was lifted, because those things that were cursed or smote are gone. And therefore, how can we point to a change? However, the earth, on the other hand, that is something that has endured regardless of the changing life upon it. Thus, by having this dual nature, our verse incorporates this nuance of focusing both on the earth as well as the creatures. It reminds us that the earth was still suffering from the effect of previous curses. So, what were the previous curses? Well, let's get a little bit of a reminder. What God undertook in this verse, here in Genesis 8, was not to punish the earth again on account of man's deeds, as he had done when Adam sinned and when Cain sinned. You will, I'm sure, remember, because it was only last week that we read this, that when Adam sinned, there was a punishment upon the earth for the labor with which we would need to exert ourselves to extract goodness from the earth. Likewise, when Cain murdered Abel, there was a curse for him because of the blood that he had poured into the earth. So those were not just curses for Adam and Cain. Those were curses that were embedded in the world itself. Now, however, at the end of the flood, God is making a statement that even if humanity messes up again, the earth is not going to be punished for this. And indeed, our commentators and traditional midrash say that Noach was the one who ushered in an era when the curse of Adam and Cain were gone. That the idea that we would be especially prone to suffering in the process of gathering our food from the earth was no longer the case. That we reached rest, hence the name Noach, which can mean rest, during his time, and that curse was finally lifted. Not even a part of the earth would henceforth be cursed on account of man's actions or inactions. So God is really going out of his way here to say this is not going to happen again. In addition, God expressed his satisfaction with Noach's sacrifice and promised not to smite whole categories of creature, even when this did not involve destroying their habitat. So we get a double limitation on what God will do in the future in response to humanity's evil. One, God will not destroy the place that they live. God will not destroy the world. And two, God is not going to destroy the living creatures, even if it could be done so without destroying the place they lived. Meaning, even if God could selectively exterminate the sinful people on the earth without causing a flood or some other catastrophe like with Adam that affected the entire planet, God is still not going to do it. God will neither destroy the world nor destroy humanity, even without destroying the world. Now, those are fairly big statements, and they are, as we're going to talk about, going to be very critical for understanding our overall path here from the story of Noach and what we should be understanding from it. But Radak is going to help us bridge that gap a little bit further. As you know, I mean, I'd love to just give my own opinions, but I always want to make sure that people see that the opinions I'm giving are firmly rooted in the insights of our tradition and not just the ramblings of a 21st century guy. So he, meaning God, foresaw in his mind that he would not again have to wreak wholesale destruction on earth, seeing that it would not happen again that the majority of the human species would be as depraved as those before the deluge. All right, so what Radak is trying to say is the only way God could make the promise that he just made, which Or HaChaim tried to clarify us, not destroy the world, not destroy humanity, would be if God, who can perceive all of time as unfolding simultaneously, if God could see that at no point past this era would there ever be the need to do so, because the majority of humanity would never become as terrible as they were during that time before the flood. So God's disgust with humanity was a unique and singular event in the timeline of all of existence. And it is one that is not going to repeat. And we know it won't repeat because God just promised not to make a repeated action, meaning like the flood. And the only way God could promise not to do that again is if there would be no need to do that again. I know that the whole time travel thing is always hard for the human brain. But if it'd be like saying, you know, I'm at the end of my my time working at a particular company, and so I need to hand over my keys. Well, you could also read that backwards. If I'm handing over my keys, it must be because I'm not going to be doing this work anymore. So what we got is the sign of God handing in the keys. He's handing over the keys to the arsenal of destruction. And the only reason he would be doing that is if he knows he's not going to be using that arsenal ever again, because he'll have no cause. So that is how we unpack that statement that God is promising to humanity. So how do we know that God won't have to do this again? Well, not just because God showed us by making the promise, but also because God knows there is going to be a chain of events that ensures that that won't happen. Again, time travel is very confusing. The report of what happened during the generation of the deluge was handed down from generation to generation and served as a warning against man again becoming as corrupt as at that time. God would not again punish the community at large on account of depraved individuals, but he would punish all the individuals who were wicked, as he demonstrated when he destroyed Sodom and its satellites. So we're not saying there aren't going to be bad people. There will be bad people. But we are saying that when God deals with those bad people in a very direct manner, it will be only those bad people that are harmed, not a larger population that is caught up in the swamp of evil. That it will be a surgical strike, if you will, rather than collective punishment. But that is partly because the people will have learned to have avoided such terrible behavior. And yes, I know that all of us are aghast at the modern examples of terrible behavior. For example, the horrible terrorist attacks in Israel on Simchat Torah. But that is not as bad as the behavior of the people before the flood, which can put things onto a horrible perspective. But it does mean that we have actually improved. And again, actually, statistics and research has borne this out, that humanity is more moral today, by and large, and on the average, than it has been in the past. Despite people complaining about the moral degradation of society, more people live in peace, freedom, security, with more individual rights and with better respect for their fellow creatures and humans than ever before in human history. We don't always hear that on the media, but you'll just have to take my word for it today that that actually is the stats. And please go out and look into it if you would like to be confirmed, like it to be confirmed directly. Okay, now there is a codicil, I guess you can call it, in our verse 21 that we need to unpack more to understand the lesson that is being taught here. And that is that when God says, I will never curse the ground again, he does say it very clearly, ba'avur ha'adam, on account of humanity. And then goes on to say, because since the heart of man is made wickedly, is made wickedly from his youth. That explanation, description, we're going to have to try and figure out how we should read that, is critical in unpacking all of this. And note as well the beautiful literary style here that comes from using the metaphors in Hebrew, that God says in his heart, and then God also talks about the human heart, that it's God's heart is reflecting upon the human heart. It's a literary poetic device that well, I find quite striking. Okay, so what does Radak do with that information? Well, when God says on account of the wicked people among mankind, what does he mean by that? He means, like we just said, rather those will be killed so that the earth will be at the disposal of the good people, that God is going to have more surgical precision in the targeting of those that are bad. If small parts of the earth would indeed be destroyed, as happened in the case of Sodom, and that part of Jordan Valley, meaning the satellite areas, this cannot be considered as destruction of the earth. Such destructions will be understood as the destruction of that particular population, including the earth they had dwelled on. So there's a little bit of a machloket, of a debate of whether or not God is still willing to destroy parts of the habitat, unlike our earlier reflection. But it is also just trying to establish that whatever God does in the future will be much more targeted. Only the precise people engaged in their terrible deeds will be the ones that are targeted, for punishment in that case. And if part of the earth they're on happens to be damaged as well, Radak says that is also not a violation of God's promise here. But God is going to focus his influence over the natural order, over the flow of history, to try and aim towards those that are the actual wicked people rather than the general population. Now, what do we do about that second portion, right? Ba'avur ha'adam, okay, Radak, that makes some sense, but what do we mean by Yetzer Lev ha'adam, ra, minura? What do we mean by this has been formed in his heart as being evil since the beginning? Well, Radak again is going to try and help us understand. I found him very useful in this particular parasha. This urge that's being described here, this heart that is being described, is called Yetzer, as it was formed at the same time as the fetus. So this is a little bit of a play on words. Doesn't really work in English, but this word Yetzer that's here is used in Jewish thought to mean Yetzer Hara, usually translated as evil inclination, but its root is overlaps with the root for creation, for the formation of something. So what Radak is saying is that when it says that this urge to do bad is in us from youth, what it means is that this urge is formed when we are formed, that from the earliest biological formation of what will eventually become a human being, we already have the elements of this Yetzer Hara, this evil urge, this evil inclination. Now, the reason why the Torah writes from his youth is that the evil urge is with man from an earlier age than the impulse to do good. It doesn't mean, in Radak's opinion, and there are others that debate this, that it appears when someone becomes a Na'ar, which is usually around the age of 11, 12 or so, but instead, this is something that just happens in the earlier stages, meaning all the way back when we're born, as opposed to the impulse to do good, which the latter urge, the impulse to do good, becomes active in a man only with the advent of maturity at the age of 13. As we know from Job 11:12, a hollow man will get understanding when a wild ass is born a man. When you become an actual adult in the eyes of Jewish law, then the hollowness that was in you will finally have understanding, and that rebellious wild ass of you will eventually become a person. So what that interpretation of Job is saying is that at around the age of maturity, the impulse to do good finally seems to kick in. Now, what does that mean? Are we talking about original sin here? Are we talking about people being inherently evil? No, it's much more nuanced than that. This is not saying that a human being is born as a terrible rampaging monster, although some parents of newborns may feel that way. Instead, it is trying to say that a newborn is full of selfish desire, not because it is evil, but because that is simply its nature. As a newborn, we want food, we want attention, we want to be comfortable, we want to sleep, and things that prevent us from doing those things will hear our scream. As we grow older, we continue to focus primarily on ourselves. Again, not in a terrible, mean, and a nasty way, as we would describe it if an adult behaved that way, but we make allowances for toddlers and children to behave in ways that are totally unacceptable for an adult, precisely because we recognize that their impulses are for what they like, what they want, what they think they need, and all of those emotions can lead them to bad behavior. And then it's a parent's job to guide them away from that and to make sure that they eventually develop an understanding and a conscience that will lead them on the right path. And that, of course, begins to materialize around the time of the maturation of the mind, which really kicks in around the age of puberty. Even before that, if a child is behaving well, it is often behaving well as a form of training rather than as a form of understanding. They haven't really chosen to be righteous and to be good because they don't really understand what's going on. They've simply learned to behave that way, which is important. We want it to be a natural, almost automatic action that a person behave well, but we should recognize that the understanding that is behind a 5-year-old being kind and gentle is a different type of understanding than when a 50-year-old is being kind and gentle. Okay, now with that in mind, seeing that man had been formed without the benefit of the impulse to do what is good or useful, rather than what is designed to gratify his base urges, as God decided in his wisdom to do. By the way, one of the reasons, of course, why God would decide to create us in this way is because children do need a lot of help and attention. And if they were not given to those base appetites and expressing them as loudly as they do, unfortunately, many parents would not step up to the task of taking care of them as well as they should. A child has to look out for itself, and seeing that it lacks so many tools to do so by itself, it's going to require a lot of adult assistance, and it's going to tell you that as loud as possible. Seeing that man was part of the overall scheme of nature, he will become guilty of sin again and again, with the exception of an infinitely small percentage of people. There might be a few mutants that avoid this, but most of us, with just that base instinct left to our own devices, would end up in some pretty nasty situations. That's why we need adults around us to guide us. Therefore, God recognizing this fact, God would not continue to punish mankind at large on account of most people acting out their natural inclinations. Now, again, here we have a debate that it's not just, as we saw earlier, that, let's scroll it back up because it's always good to point it out and compare, that it's not just that the majority would not be as depraved, but instead it is that also God is understanding that even if the majority behaved that way, it would be because of their original development line, which can easily get stuck in animal mode, which can easily get stuck in the non-matured, non-moral mode. And because of that, entire communities, if not societies, could begin to become perpetuated in that behavior. God recognizes this here at the end of the flood and says, okay, then if that's the way they are, it's not going to be productive for me to continue to flood the world. The hope that we had in the previous comment that the people would remember the flood and would learn from it and do better is being counterbalanced here by a little bit of pessimism that, well, yeah, but actually a lot of people are not going to mature past that base childlike idea of I want what I want, and because I want it, it must be okay. And they're going to behave terribly as adults, and that's going to cause lots of problems in the society. And we can't just keep blowing up the world because of it. God can't just keep wiping it across and then starting again, because that's going to repeat. Even the children of Noah are going to behave badly, and certainly the grandchildren and great-grandchildren and so forth are going to behave badly. Therefore, God is saying, I guess that wiping the earth clean is not going to actually fix the situation. Okay, we're almost done, and hopefully you can see me building towards the synthesis of all of these ideas. So let's go ahead and finish up with our last comment. The inclination of man's heart is evil from its youth. The quote we were now wrestling with. This statement is best understood as similar to the one in Bava Kama, 39a. The Talmud discusses an incident in which a bull trained to perform in an arena has gored someone. That is to say, during the Roman times and the late classical period, they had some pretty messed up forms of entertainment, and they trained animals to attack, not just to be aggressive in their natural way, but to very deliberately try to kill people. So You have a bull that's been trained in that way. Such an animal is not subject to the death penalty, as it only did what it was expected to do. A reminder that, as we'll see from Exodus 21, an animal that gores a human being is usually executed. This animal, which gores someone after having been trained to do so, is not executed. The reason cited in that Mishnah is that the Torah uses the future tense for gore in Exodus 21:28, when it provides the death penalty for oxen which gore a human being. Animals which have been trained to do just that are not culpable for doing what comes naturally. So it's only supposed to be that if they happen to gore, then we would hold them liable and there would be an execution for the animal. But if they are goring, if that's just what they do from start to finish, they were raised as gorers, then there's no if involved in that. That's just their nature. And as such, you cannot hold them culpable for just being what they have been made to be. Similarly, man, equipped as he is with an evil instinct from birth, is not culpable until he has learned to distinguish right from wrong. This rule applies to minors not being subject to the judiciary process. If an underage Jewish person violates a commandment, they are not held liable, neither in the sight of God nor in the sight of the earthly court. So what we are seeing here is that there is an understanding that humanity, at least for part of its existence, is unaware of right from wrong, and if anything has actually been set up to prefer what will eventually be seen as wrong while it is young. And that means we can't really punish a child in the sense that, in the same way we would punish an adult. They are, however, punishable by God for not having heeded his call. Now, that means if they continue to ignore the call, if they never mature, then there is a problem. And in that respect, man is not like the bull we mentioned, right? The bull doesn't get a choice. People do. Man's advantage over the beast is his knowledge of good and evil. He is charged with despising evil and choosing what is good. The fact that man was born with the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, only, meaning that that's the impulse we have just as an infant, acts like an extenuating circumstances, protecting him against God's anger. So God understands, because that's how we were made, and God knows this, that we are going to behave this way, and that it will be hard for us to unlearn those inclinations that we had from birth, but that we can and should, that we actually have that as our calling in life, and that we've been given a capacity which far outstrips that of any other animal to be able to develop a sense of right and wrong and to consistently choose what is right and to avoid what is wrong. Okay, so what does all this mean? Well, did God not know this? I mean, God literally made Adam and Chava. God was there when they got formed. God saw them eat from the fruit, and again, knew that they were going to, and that would give them the knowledge of good and evil. And then yet 10 generations later, he's like, oh, I can't believe they turned out so rotten. Of course, God knew that that's what they would do. And then at the end of the flood, God is like, oh, you know what? Flood isn't a good idea because people are like that. Yeah. So I probably shouldn't destroy the entire world just because they're all getting pretty bad. I better think of a better way to focus on this. Okay. Newsflash, God's opinion didn't change at any point in this story. God is God, past, present, and future, and is unchanging. What the Torah is trying to do is lead us through the stories of creation and Noah and onward until we get up to the time of Abraham with a basic understanding of what we should expect in the world around us and what we should expect from ourselves. And it is trying to say that, no, God is not going to destroy the world. I don't care how many bad people you've met. I don't care how bad you are. God is not going to wipe the entire world clean just because you are really frustrated that everyone else in the world is an idiot. That's not the way God works. Let me tell you a story about something that would look like. And then the story of the flood comes in, and it comes in to tell us that God, God thought this might work, but then it turned out it didn't, because after all, the next chapter, they're already behaving badly again. And God recognized that this is not a solution. So this isn't us saying that God actually changed God's mind. This is us telling ourselves that we should understand that God will not do this, because had it played out like this, God certainly would not have ever done it again. I know there were a lot of conditional statements in that sentence, and I hope that my English was correct. Yes, sometimes English grammar makes conversation hard, but it also makes it fun on occasion. So it's telling us that God is not a world destroyer, that is not God's role in the world. It also is telling us to be patient with ourselves and to be patient with each other, that we all have to learn how to be good people, that we are not automatically good, and that in fact our basic animal type instincts, the dirt part of us, if you will, is going to gravitate towards behaviors which, left unchecked and unremedied by adulthood, will create an evil society. The selfishness of a toddler is perfectly fine when they are 2. That is not great when they are 22. And if everyone in society behaves like a toddler does, society is going to indeed be an evil place to live. So we need to recognize that God is patient with us, and we should be patient with us, that God expects more from us, and that we should expect more from us, and that God is not going to fix these problems by obliterating us and the world. And in fact, God may, yes, punish individuals, but even that punishment, as we'll see in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah coming up quite soon, will be held in abeyance, that it will not be an instant reaction. And even though there we see a large group being destroyed, the overall arc of the Torah's discussion of this is moving the reader more and more towards the idea that it is the individual who is going to be punished, and it is the individual who will be rewarded. That this notion of global or even communal is used only in a very limited sense by the time the Torah has finished its story, but instead the strong emphasis is on the individual's allegiance to Torah and to God and their culpability. And even there, after they are an adult, God is still patient with them, giving them time to fix their mistakes, giving them time to do teshuvah, always giving them time to come home. Doesn't mean it'll last forever. Doesn't mean life lasts forever. And yes, we believe justice will always come eventually. But there is this mixture of the threat of punishment with a much larger dose of patience and encouragement to return and fix the problems that have generated the need for justice in this case. With that, hopefully you can understand that this whole bracketed section of Noah, from God's regret to God's resolution, is not trying to teach us something about God's change, because God didn't change, just like God doesn't smell and God doesn't have a physical heart. God didn't change, but our understanding of God is meant to change through this story. That our understanding of a God that has the power to create the entire universe might have led us to think that God would therefore recreate the universe constantly in order to make it, in quote, better. But that is not the case. The way that humans are, which is how they are meant to be, has a built-in challenge for us to overcome. But God is not going to punish that built-in challenge, that Yetzer Hara, prematurely or excessively, because after all, that is the way we are. We just have to live up to the expectation of overcoming that challenge, of moving past it. And that's what the rest of the Torah is for. If God thought that he could keep pulling the lever on the slot machine and wipe out the world and just keep doing it over and over again until he got the good ones with humans that only did what was good, then we would have a very different expectation of the world, and we wouldn't need the Torah. We would just wait until we happen to be born, I guess, because, who knows whether we would still be around, into the world where we happen to all do right, we just got lucky and became consistently moral for no other reason. That's not the way the world works, says the story of Noah. God is not going to wipe out the world to make it better, because that won't make it better. Yes, it can incentivize people to behave better, but it won't actually force them to be better, and they are still going to make mistakes. Therefore, the Torah needs a different way to make the world better. What is the solution? Relationship with God, understanding of the commandments, and a desire for humans to actually choose to walk that path and do what's right. It's a lot harder than just pulling the slot machine, but there is no other way to achieve that result. And this, like I said, is setting up the entire purpose for all that comes next in the Torah. If the story of Noah hadn't existed, then we would just think, why is God bother trying to teach us? Just start over and get better students that don't need teaching in the first place. That's not how it works, says the story of Noah. You shouldn't expect it. God never expected it, but we had to hear it. Because if we hadn't heard it, we would be wondering why things were going on the way they are. So hopefully I've repeated it in enough different ways that it's gotten through. I know it's a bit of a radical concept to many who view the story through very different lenses and who view our relationship with God in very different ways. It is very much the opposite of the idea of original sin or of a priori damnation, but it is teaching us something very powerful about the path we must choose to walk and how we choose to walk it and what God is doing to walk it with us. With that, I wish everybody well, and especially everyone in the land of Israel. I wish them all good fortune and the ability to overcome these problems and to be able to target and root out those that cause evil. Take care and be well.